Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character.
Good morning, everyone. You're tuned into Coravanta, and I'm Lars Harry, bringing you everything you need to know as you head into your day. And honestly, what a chaotic week it has been. There's a lot to unpack, and none of it is small. From celebrity legal drama that keeps getting messier, to courtroom developments that feel straight out of a documentary, to global tensions that are starting to unite people who normally don't agree on anything, this episode is loaded. So settle in, because we're going to walk through it all carefully. Let's start with the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni situation, because this story just refuses to slow down. Every time it seems like things might calm down, something new surfaces that pulls even more people into the narrative. And now, somehow, Taylor Swift has been pulled into the orbit of this situation, not directly, but through connections that are raising eyebrows and questions. We're going to get into that in detail shortly, because the connections being discussed right now are not simple, and they're definitely not. But before we go there, we need to talk about another case that has been developing in parallel, one that has quietly turned into what some are calling one of the strangest legal sagas in recent memory. I'm talking about the Laura Owens case. If you've been following along, you already know this story has taken some unbelievable turns. The Justice for Clayton movement has been gaining traction, and the case itself, centered around allegations of fake pregnancies and manipulated paternity claims, has become something people can't stop watching. And now, new developments suggest that what we've seen so far might only be part of a much bigger pattern. There was a recent headline that caught attention, suggesting that Clayton might not be the only alleged victim connected to Laura Owens. And to be honest, that's not exactly shocking to those who've been paying close attention. It's more like confirmation of what many already suspected. Investigative reporting has indicated that prosecutors believe this may not be the first time Owens has been involved in a situation like this. That's a serious implication, because it changes the scope of the case entirely. Instead of being a single incident, it starts to look like a potential pattern of behavior, and that's something juries tend to take very seriously. Now, Owens' legal team is in a difficult position. Her attorney has publicly stated that they're not yet ready to seriously consider a plea agreement, but they're reviewing all the evidence and that discussions could happen in the coming weeks. That's legal language for we're weighing our options very carefully, because what's at stake here is significant. If this case goes to trial, it's expected to happen in July. And from what's being discussed behind the scenes, there is indeed a potential plea deal on the table. The details aren't public, but insider information suggests that it could allow Owens to avoid jail time, which would be a major outcome considering the number of charges involved. We're talking about 14 felony charges. That's not minor. That's not something you casually walk away from. So if a plea deal reduces that number significantly, say down to 4 or 5 charges, and includes an admission of wrongdoing, it might be seen as the safer path from a defense perspective. But here's the real question: will she take it? Because accepting a plea deal requires acknowledging at least part of the accusations, and sometimes people become so committed to their version of events that stepping back becomes almost impossible. It's not just a legal decision, it's psychological, reputational, and deeply personal. And then there's the challenge her attorney faces. Imagine trying to present this case to a jury. You have layers of digital evidence, allegations involving fabricated narratives, and a public already forming strong opinions. That's not easy to manage in a courtroom setting where clarity matters. This case has already crossed into public consciousness in a big way. Podcasts, investigative pieces, and online discussions have turned it into something much bigger than a typical legal dispute. It has all the elements of a future documentary: complex characters, high stakes, and a trail of actions that raise more questions the deeper you go. And speaking of complexity, let's shift back to the Blake Lively versus Justin Baldoni situation, because this is where things start to intersect with broader cultural attention. Now, here's where Taylor Swift enters the picture, not as a direct participant, but through a connection that people are analyzing very closely. Recently, Taylor Swift was spotted in New York City with her friend Ashley Ovyorn, a fashion influencer who has been part of her social circle for some time. On the surface, that's completely normal. Taylor Swift being photographed with a friend is not unusual, it happens all the time. But what makes this different is the growing discussion around Ashley Ovyorn's alleged role as a connecting figure between Blake Lively and another key individual, Stephanie Jones, and this is where things get complicated. Because part of the controversy surrounding the Baldoni case involves what's being described by some as a sham subpoena. The claim is that a legal mechanism may have been used in a questionable way, creating a case structure involving unnamed individuals in order to obtain specific communications or records. Now, to be very clear, these are allegations and interpretations that are still being debated. Courts will ultimately determine what is valid and what is not. But the reason this matters is because of what those records allegedly contained, communications that may have played a role in shaping public narratives, including media coverage. So when people see a connection, even an indirect one, between individuals involved in that process and someone as globally recognized as Taylor Swift, it naturally draws attention. It doesn't mean wrongdoing. It doesn't mean guilt. But it does mean scrutiny. And that's the environment we're in right now, one where every connection is examined, every appearance is analyzed, and every association becomes part of a larger puzzle people are trying to solve. Some observers have gone as far as suggesting that these public sightings indicate coordination or alignment. Others argue that it's simply a case of people maintaining their friendships regardless of outside noise, and the truth is, we don't fully know. That's an important point that often gets lost in these discussions. There's a difference between what can be proven, what is suggested, and what is assumed. And when emotions run high, especially in cases where public opinion is strongly divided, those lines can blur very quickly. From my perspective, maintaining credibility means being willing to look at all sides, even when one narrative feels more convincing than another. It's easy to fall into the trap of defending one side completely and dismissing the other, but real understanding usually sits somewhere in the middle. For example, if someone genuinely believes that wrongdoing occurred, their actions, even if controversial, might be driven by that belief. That doesn't automatically justify those actions, but it does add context. At the same time, accusations and strategies used in high-profile disputes can have real consequences, especially when media coverage amplifies them. Careers, reputations, and opportunities can all be affected long before a case is fully resolved. And that brings us to another key point in this situation, the idea of cancellation. There's been a lot of debate about whether Justin Baldoni has been cancelled. And this is where definitions matter, because cancellation doesn't necessarily mean someone disappears completely or never works again. In many cases, it simply means that certain doors close, particularly within major industry structures. From what can be observed, Baldoni's situation appears to reflect that kind of shift. While he may still be active in creative roles, producing, directing, building projects, the trajectory you might expect for someone in his position as and following a successful film doesn't seem to be happening in the usual way. And that raises questions, because typically, after a major success, opportunities increase. Visibility leads to casting offers, partnerships, and momentum. When that momentum isn't visible, people start to wonder why. Some argue it's a strategic pause. Others believe it's the result of industry pressure or reputational impact. The reality could be a mix of both. What's clear is that influence within the entertainment industry is not evenly distributed. Relationships, agencies, media narratives, all of these factors play a role in shaping who gets opportunities and who doesn't. And when a high-profile conflict intersects with those systems, the effects can be significant. That doesn't mean the outcome is permanent. We've seen many cases where individuals faced setbacks and later rebuilt their careers. But it does mean that, in the short term, the impact is real. So as this situation continues to unfold, the key thing to watch isn't just the legal arguments, it's the broader ripple effects. Who continues to work with whom? Which projects move forward? Which ones don't? Because sometimes, the clearest signals aren't found in statements or headlines, but in actions, and right now, there's a lot happening beneath the surface. Now picking up where we left off, the conversation shifts away from Hollywood for a moment, but the intensity doesn't drop at all. In fact, in some ways, it escalates, because now we're stepping into something much bigger than celebrity disputes. We're stepping into global politics, war, and a growing sense that people across completely different ideologies are starting to find common ground on at least one issue. And that issue is simple. People are tired of war. What's interesting, and honestly rare, is seeing voices from both sides of the political spectrum beginning to overlap in their criticism. Normally, these sides disagree on almost everything. But right now, there's a noticeable shift happening, where individuals who would usually oppose each other are saying, in different ways, that this situation isn't working. You've got commentators, analysts, and public figures who have historically supported leadership now openly questioning decisions. And that's not a small thing. It takes a certain level of pressure, public, economic, and political, for that kind of shift to happen. One of the more talked about moments recently involved a major media personality strongly criticizing decisions related to foreign policy and the handling of tensions in the Middle East. The criticism wasn't subtle either. It was direct, extended, and covered multiple angles, from military strategy to rhetoric to long-term consequences, and what made it stand out even more was the reaction from people who don't usually agree with that voice. Instead of pushing back, many acknowledged that the points being made were valid. That's when you know something unusual is happening, when agreement starts to replace the usual automatic opposition, because for years, the pattern has been predictable. One side says something, the other side rejects it, and nothing really changes. But now, with rising costs, global instability, and visible consequences, the conversation is becoming harder to ignore. At the center of it all is a basic question: what is the benefit? When people look at the economic impact alone, the frustration becomes understandable. Rising fuel costs, increased spending, pressure on public resources, these are things that directly affect everyday life. It's no longer an abstract issue happening far away. It shows up in bills, in prices, in long-term uncertainty, and then there's the safety aspect. Whenever conflict escalates, there's always the risk of broader consequences. People start thinking about retaliation, about global reactions, about what it means not just for soldiers or governments, but for civilians. This is where the conversation becomes more emotional, because it's not just about policy anymore, it's about human cost. Reports, images, and accounts coming out of conflict zones have intensified the debate. Civilian casualties, damaged infrastructure, humanitarian concerns, these aren't theoretical discussions. They're real, and they're being documented in real time. Different groups interpret these events in different ways, of course. Some frame it as necessary action, others as excessive force. But regardless of interpretation, the scale of the situation has made it impossible to ignore, and for many people, the idea that taxpayer money is connected to these outcomes has become a major point of concern. That's where frustration turns into something stronger, a demand for accountability, because at the end of the day, people want to know where their money is going and why. There's also a growing argument that resources could be used differently. Instead of funding external conflicts, why not invest more heavily in domestic issues? Infrastructure, healthcare, education, these are areas that consistently come up in these discussions. It's not a new argument, but it's gaining more traction now because the contrast feels sharper. When people see large sums being allocated abroad while problems at home remain unresolved, it creates a sense of imbalance. And that imbalance is what's driving more people from different backgrounds, beliefs, and political identities to speak up. Another layer to this conversation is the idea of military expansion and preparedness. Recent discussions about automatically registering young men for draft eligibility have added fuel to the fire. Even if it's framed as a procedural update, the symbolism of it is powerful because it signals the possibility, however distant, of escalation, and for younger generations, that's a serious thought. The idea that global decisions could directly affect their future in such a personal way is not something they take lightly. At the same time, questions are being raised about efficiency and strategy. There have been reports of logistical issues, situations where planning and communication didn't align the way they should have. These kinds of stories, whether isolated or systemic, contribute to a broader perception problem. People start asking, if the execution isn't flawless, why take the risk at all? And then there's the financial scale of it all. Numbers get thrown around: billions, trillions, and at some point, they stop feeling real. But when broken down, the impact becomes clearer. Budgets expand, priorities shift, and suddenly the conversation isn't just about defense, it's about sustainability. How long can this continue? What are the long-term consequences? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. But the fact that more people are asking them, and asking them loudly, is significant. Even within circles that traditionally support strong military action, there's a noticeable shift toward questioning rather than automatically agreeing. That doesn't mean opinions have completely changed, but it does mean the conversation is evolving. And that evolution is important, because real change, historically, doesn't happen when everyone agrees. It happens when enough people, even those who usually disagree, find common ground on something specific. Right now, that common ground seems to be forming around the idea that endless conflict is not sustainable. That doesn't mean isolation. It doesn't mean ignoring global responsibilities. But it does mean rethinking priorities and strategies in a way that reflects current realities rather than past assumptions. And as this discussion continues, it's likely to shape not just policy decisions, but public perception as well, because ultimately, leaders respond to pressure, and pressure comes from people. Now, bringing it back to the broader theme of everything we've covered today, there's a surprising connection between these two very different topics: celebrity legal drama and global politics. And that connection is influence. In both cases, influence shapes narratives, affects outcomes, and determines who gets heard and who doesn't. Whether it's media coverage of a legal dispute or public framing of a geopolitical issue, the way information is presented matters. It affects how people think, how they react, and what they believe. That's why it's important to stay aware, to question, and to look beyond the surface whenever possible, because the world right now is loud. There's constant information, constant updates, constant opinions. And in that noise, it's easy to lose clarity. But if there's one thing this week has shown, it's that people are paying attention more than ever. They're connecting dots, asking questions, and refusing to just accept things at face value. And whether that leads to change or not remains to be seen, but it's definitely something to watch. That's where we'll leave it for now. It's been a lot to take in, and honestly, it's the kind of news cycle that can leave you feeling a bit overwhelmed. But it's also a reminder of how interconnected everything has become, from entertainment to law to global affairs. This is the world we're navigating, and staying informed is part of understanding it. We'll be back again soon with more updates, more analysis, and more of the stories that are shaping the moment. Until then, stay aware, stay grounded, and we'll talk again very soon.